We begin studying the cardiovascular system by looking at blood. After we understand the components of blood and their functions, we'll move on to the heart and how the heart pumps this blood. And then finally, the third component of the cardiovascular system is going to be blood vessels and learning about concepts such as blood pressure, but also identifying major arteries and veins of the body. So let's begin with blood. Blood has three main functions. One is transportation. Blood transports things throughout the body. Those things include gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients such as glucose, amino acids, vitamins and minerals, regulatory substances like hormones and enzymes. Heat is distributed throughout the body within blood, and blood helps remove heat. And then finally, blood transports waste products from their sites of production to organs that can eliminate the waste, such as kidneys. The second major function is to regulate homeostasis. Blood maintains the proper pH of tissues. Blood helps maintain the proper temperature of tissues. And blood helps maintain the proper water content of tissues and cells. The third function is to protect against excessive fluid loss by clotting blood. So if there's a wound and we hemorrhage, blood has an intrinsic mechanism to clot and prevent further blood loss. The blood also protects us from infections. It does this by transporting white blood cells to the site of infection. So blood works together with your immune system to protect you from disease. Okay, let's look at all the components of blood. This is a good graph to understand how we can separate out blood into individual components and then look at the function of those components. So let's begin by just looking at the entire body. The entire body is made up of 8% blood. 92% is everything else. So now we take that 8% of the body, known as whole blood, and we can begin to separate it out. One way to do this is actually by putting a test tube of blood in an instrument called a centrifuge. Centrifuged blood allows us to separate out components. The more dense components settle to the bottom, like the red blood cells. Red blood cells are extremely dense because they are loaded with a protein called hemoglobin. Sitting on top of the very dense red blood cells are the white blood cells and platelets, and then the least dense component is the liquid part, the plasma. So notice some numbers. About 55% of whole blood is liquid plasma. 45, or just above 45, are red blood cells, but also the formed elements, which include not just the red blood cells, but also white blood cells and platelets. So if we look at the chart, we see here we've taken the plasma, 55%, and then we can separate it out further. We take the 45% formed elements, which include cells like red blood cells, the different white blood cells, and the little platelets. So we can separate out the formed elements into those three categories: platelets, white blood cells, and red blood cells. And then we can further divide the white blood cells up into their specific types. But let's go back up to the plasma first. Plasma is the liquid portion, so it's going to be largely water. So 91.5% of plasma is water. So that means, if you did the math, about 50% of your blood is water. 7% of the plasma are proteins. So there's quite a bit of protein in blood plasma. These proteins can be then separated out into the specific types or categories, like the albumins, which are the majority of the proteins found in your plasma, the globulins, which are going to include things like antibodies that protect you from disease. Fibrinogen is 7% of the proteins. Fibrinogen, we're going to see its involvement in blood clotting. Then we notice down here about 1.5% of the plasma are other things. Things like electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, and others. Nutrients, such as glucose and amino acids. Gases, such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, but keep in mind, most of the oxygen is found in the red blood cells, and most of the carbon dioxide produced by the body gets converted into another molecule. But there are some gases in the plasma. Regulatory substances, those would be, for example, protein or other types of hormones. And then finally, waste products. The formed elements we'll get to throughout the rest of the PowerPoint, but again, you'll notice that per microliter, there's going to be about 5 million red blood cells, 5 to 10,000 white blood cells, and somewhere between 150,000 to 400,000 platelets. Looking at the white blood cells, there are different types. Most of them in your bloodstream are called neutrophils, 60 to 70%. Lymphocytes are quite abundant, 20 to 25% of your white blood cells. Monocytes, eosinophils, and then the rarest is the basophil. We're going to get to all these guys and their functions later on in this PowerPoint. This is a pretty thorough table talking specifically about the functions of the plasma. And you can spend some time reviewing this table on your own, but you'll see that there's the water component, which acts as the primary solvent, which allows other molecules to dissolve in your blood. The plasma proteins, albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. Albumins being the most abundant, globulins being mostly made up of immunoglobulins, which are antibodies, which can attack viruses and bacteria. And then finally, fibrinogen, which acts in your blood clotting mechanism. Other solutes, such as electrolytes, nutrients, gases, regulatory substances like enzymes, hormones, and then finally waste products produced by cells. So you can go through each of these specifically and understand their major roles when it comes to the human body function. In the next video, we're going to start to look at the specific formed elements